The loneliest moments in life are not when someone leaves you behind, but when you realize they were already gone long before you noticed. I became a widow on a quiet Tuesday morning in October. After 41 years of marriage, the house felt unfamiliar without my husband, Charles. Every room seemed larger. Every sound seemed louder. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly felt intrusive, as if it were counting every second of my grief. My name is Eleanor Parker, and at 67 years old, I thought I understood what loneliness looked like. I was wrong. The funeral had taken place 2 weeks earlier. Friends had brought casseroles. Neighbors had offered sympathy. Family members had hugged me and promised to stay close. Then, little by little, everyone returned to their normal lives. The phone rang less often. The visits became shorter. The silence grew longer. One morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen staring at an empty chair where Charles used to sit every day at breakfast. Without thinking, I poured 2 cups of coffee. I stood there for several seconds before realizing my mistake. I poured the second cup down the sink and suddenly felt older than I had the day before. That afternoon, I decided to do something simple, something normal. I called my son Michael and invited him to dinner. Just the 2 of us. Nothing special. No holiday. No celebration. I simply wanted to spend an evening with my son. "That sounds great, Mom," he said immediately. Hearing those words warmed something inside me. "How about Saturday?" "Saturday works," he replied. "I will be there." For the first time in weeks, I had something to look forward to. The next few days passed differently. I found myself planning meals again, thinking about recipes Michael loved when he was younger. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, fresh apple pie. The kind of meal that filled a house with comforting smells and familiar memories. Saturday morning arrived bright and cool. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as I prepared everything carefully. The house smelled wonderful by noon. I even pulled out my good dishes from the dining room cabinet. Not because dinner needed to be formal, because I wanted the evening to matter. As I set the table, memories followed me from room to room. Michael at age 10 helping his father rake leaves in the backyard. Michael at 16 learning to drive. Michael at 25 standing proudly beside Jessica on their wedding day. Back then, I truly believed she was becoming part of our family. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A message from Michael. I smiled before reading it. Then the smile slowly disappeared. "Mom, something came up. Jessica already made plans for tonight. Maybe another time." I stared at the screen. Just 12 words. 12 simple words that somehow made the house feel empty again. I read the message 3 times. Then 4. Something about it felt strange. Michael never forgot plans. Especially not plans he had agreed to himself. I told myself not to overthink it. Yet as evening approached, a feeling settled quietly in my chest. A feeling I could not explain. I reheated the pot roast anyway. Set the table anyway. Waited anyway. Because sometimes hope stays seated long after common sense has already left the room. And deep down, I could not shake the feeling that Jessica's other plans were not nearly as simple as they sounded. I sat alone at the dining room table long after the food had cooled. The pot roast remained untouched except for the small portion I forced myself to eat. The second place setting stayed exactly where I had arranged it that morning. Across from me, Michael's empty chair seemed to carry more weight than the furniture itself. Outside, the October sky darkened early. The trees swayed gently in the evening wind, scattering leaves across the front lawn Charles used to maintain so carefully. I eventually cleared the dishes and wrapped the leftovers. As I placed the containers into the refrigerator, I noticed how much food remained. Enough for 4 people. Enough to remind me that I had expected company. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sleep had come in short stretches. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's message. Something came up. Jessica already made plans for tonight. Maybe another time. The explanation sounded reasonable. Yet the more I thought about it, the less reasonable it felt. Michael had accepted my invitation a week earlier. He knew how difficult these weeks had been since Charles passed away. He knew I was alone. Most importantly, he knew I rarely asked for anything. By Monday afternoon, I convinced myself to let it go. Grief can make a person sensitive. Perhaps I was reading too much into a simple scheduling conflict. Then my phone rang. It was my neighbor, Linda. We had lived across the street from each other for nearly 20 years. After exchanging a few pleasantries, she casually asked how my dinner with Michael had gone. "It was postponed," I said. "Something came up." There was a brief silence. "Oh," Linda replied. "That is surprising." Something in her voice caught my attention. "Why?" Another pause followed. "I just assumed they made it after dinner." My stomach tightened slightly. "Made it where?" Linda hesitated. "The restaurant downtown. I saw Michael and Jessica there Saturday evening. They were with another couple." For a moment, I said nothing. I simply stared through the kitchen window at the empty bird feeder Charles used to refill every Sunday morning. Linda continued talking, unaware of the impact her words were having. "I thought maybe they stopped by your house first." I forced a smile into my voice and changed the subject. After ending the call, I remained standing beside the counter for several minutes. My hands rested lightly against the granite surface while my thoughts moved in circles. Michael had not been delayed by an emergency. Jessica had not already committed them to some unavoidable obligation. They had gone out to dinner. A normal dinner. Less than 15 miles from my house. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because they chose a restaurant over me. Because they never told me the truth. That evening, I found myself looking through old family photographs. One picture showed Michael at age 8 sitting beside Charles at a baseball game. Another showed our family gathered around a Thanksgiving table years earlier. Smiling faces. Shared traditions. Familiar warmth. As I turned the pages, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. The more recent the photographs became, the less often I appeared in them. Family weekends. Short vacations. Holiday gatherings. Sometimes I was present. Often I was not. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible unless someone deliberately looked for it. And now, for the first time, I was looking. I closed the album and sat quietly in the living room. The silence felt different than it had a few weeks earlier. Less confusing. More revealing. Grief had made me lonely. But something else was beginning to make me suspicious. Because one canceled dinner could be explained away. Two could be coincidence. Yet deep down, I was starting to wonder whether this story had begun long before I became a widow. And whether Jessica had been quietly rewriting my place in the family for years. By midweek, Eleanor had begun noticing patterns that had gone unseen for years. The subtle shifts in family plans, the gentle redirection of conversations when she mentioned herself, and the quiet absence of invitations had all begun to form a map she could follow. She opened her journal and began to write down every interaction, every forgotten call, every overlooked event. With each entry, the pattern grew clearer. Michael had not acted with malice. Eleanor understood that. But Jessica's influence over him and the careful steering of family decisions created a reality where Eleanor's presence became optional. That evening, she set the table again, this time for one, and poured herself a glass of iced tea. The kitchen smelled of herbs and bread she had baked earlier in the day. She sat down, looked at the empty chair across from her, and allowed herself to feel the disappointment, but also the clarity that had emerged from observing rather than reacting. She remembered her husband, Charles, and how he always emphasized patience, awareness, and the quiet power of observation. Sitting there, Eleanor realized that those qualities were now her tools to navigate the situation. After dinner, she walked into the living room where family photos lined the walls, some featuring events she had attended, others where her absence had been noted. She studied each photo carefully, noticing who had been present, who had smiled for the camera, and who had shifted focus when her image appeared. The realization struck her that this was not a single incident of oversight, but a long pattern of exclusion that had grown gradually over time. In the days that followed, Eleanor continued to observe without confrontation, paying attention to conversations in person and over the phone. She noted small details, how invitations were phrased, the timing of calls, even subtle expressions that revealed intentions she had missed before. She found strength in knowing, not in accusing, and she began to plan her approach with deliberate patience. One afternoon, while sorting through old letters and documents, she discovered notes from Michael's childhood and old holiday cards that Jessica had kept meticulously organized. Each one told a story of care and inclusion that contrasted with recent patterns. Eleanor reflected on how family dynamics shifted, and she understood that restoring her place required both awareness and strategic action. Later that week, she called her close friend Linda to discuss the patterns she had observed. Speaking aloud helped solidify her understanding, and Linda offered perspectives Eleanor had not considered, suggesting subtle ways to communicate with Michael and observe Jessica's influence without creating conflict. Eleanor spent hours that evening preparing a small notebook with notes and questions she could use in future interactions. She reviewed her finances, her calendar, and her priorities, ensuring she would be fully in control of her own space and decisions. When she finally sat down with a cup of tea, she felt a mixture of sorrow, insight, and growing determination. Eleanor knew she could no longer rely on assumptions or past goodwill. She had to navigate the family's social landscape with intelligence and care, recognizing patterns and responding deliberately rather than reacting impulsively. By the time the evening shadows lengthened and the house grew quiet, Eleanor felt a sense of preparedness she had not known since Charles passed. She was ready to engage with her son, with Jessica, and with the family, but on her own terms, and with the clarity that only careful observation and reflection could provide. The following weekend brought an opportunity Eleanor had not expected. On Friday afternoon, Michael called and invited her to a family gathering at his house on Sunday. His voice sounded cheerful, almost unusually so. He explained that a few relatives would be stopping by for lunch and thought it would be nice for everyone to spend time together. Eleanor accepted immediately. After hanging up, she sat quietly in her living room and reflected on the invitation. A month ago, she would have viewed it as a simple family event. Now, she viewed it as something else entirely, an opportunity to observe. Sunday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. Eleanor drove the 15 miles to Michael and Jessica's neighborhood shortly before noon. As she turned into the driveway, she noticed several vehicles already parked outside. Through the front windows, she could see family members moving about the house. Laughter drifted faintly through the glass. For a brief moment, she felt hopeful. Perhaps things were improving. Perhaps she had imagined more than she should have. Jessica greeted her at the door with a bright smile and a quick hug. The gesture felt practiced, polite, perfectly appropriate, yet something about it felt strangely distant. Eleanor stepped inside and immediately noticed several framed photographs displayed on a side table near the entryway. Most had been taken within the past 2 years. Family vacations, holiday celebrations, weekend outings. As she studied them, she realized once again how often she was missing from the images. The realization no longer shocked her. It simply added another piece to the growing pattern. Throughout lunch, Eleanor remained calm and attentive. She listened carefully as conversations moved from sports to holiday plans to upcoming birthdays. Several times, relatives referenced events she knew nothing about. A cabin trip scheduled for December. A summer reunion discussed months earlier. A weekend getaway planned for next spring. Each time, someone would briefly glance toward Jessica before continuing. The exchanges lasted only seconds, but Eleanor noticed every one of them. Years of life experience had taught her that important truths often lived in the spaces between words. Halfway through the afternoon, Michael's cousin Amanda sat beside Eleanor on the patio. They spoke casually about work, family, and the changing seasons. Then Amanda mentioned something unexpected. Jessica really does an amazing job keeping everyone connected through that family group chat. Eleanor smiled politely. Family group chat. Amanda immediately looked uncomfortable. Oh, I just assumed you were in it. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Amanda quickly changed the subject, but the damage had already been done. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken slightly. Another piece of information. Another small discovery. Another confirmation that family conversations were taking place somewhere she could not see. Later that afternoon, while helping clear dishes from the dining table, Eleanor overheard a brief exchange between Jessica and another relative in the kitchen. The words were quiet, almost whispered, yet one sentence reached her clearly. It is easier this way. Nothing more. No explanation. No context. Yet those 4 words lingered in her thoughts for the rest of the afternoon. Easier for whom? Easier why? As the gathering ended, Eleanor thanked everyone for lunch and prepared to leave. Jessica hugged her again at the front door. Michael promised to call soon. The words sounded sincere. Yet sincerity without action had become a familiar theme. Driving home beneath a sky streaked with orange and gold, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The uncertainty that once clouded her judgment continued to fade. She was no longer collecting suspicions. She was collecting evidence. Small pieces, quiet observations, details most people overlooked. And with every passing day, the picture became clearer. Someone had been carefully controlling her place within the family. The only question that remained was how long it had been happening and what would happen once the truth finally reached the surface. The discovery of the family group chat stayed with Eleanor for days. She did not mention it to anyone. She did not call Michael. She did not confront Jessica. Instead, she returned home and continued doing what she had been doing for weeks. Watching, listening, paying attention. The strange thing about the truth is that once you begin seeing it, more of it seems to appear on its own. The following Wednesday, Eleanor received a call from her granddaughter Sophie. At 21, Sophie was finishing her final year of college and had always shared a special bond with her grandmother. Their conversations were easy, natural, and free from the careful filtering that seemed to exist elsewhere in the family. They talked about classes, professors, and future plans. Then Sophie casually mentioned an upcoming family brunch scheduled for the following month. Eleanor remained silent for a moment. "A family brunch?" she asked. Sophie immediately sounded confused. "You know about it, right?" There it was again. The same uncomfortable pause. The same assumption that Eleanor had been included. "No," she replied gently. "I had not heard anything about it." Sophie hesitated. "That is strange. Everyone has been talking about it for weeks." After ending the call, Eleanor walked slowly into the living room and sat beside the window. Outside, the leaves continued falling from the trees. Autumn was gradually surrendering to winter. Inside, another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. This was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It was a system. Plans were being shared. Conversations were taking place. Decisions were being made. Somehow, Eleanor consistently remained outside the circle. That evening, she opened an old storage box containing family keepsakes. Inside were birthday cards, school photographs, holiday letters, and handwritten notes spanning decades. One by one, she sorted through them. The memories felt bittersweet. There was Michael's first grade report card, a Father's Day card he had helped make for Charles when he was 7 years old, a photograph from a camping trip where they spent 3 days laughing through a thunderstorm. Looking at those memories, Eleanor realized something important. The distance between herself and Michael had not happened overnight. It had happened gradually. So gradually that neither of them seemed to notice while it was happening. And somewhere along that gradual path, Jessica had become the gatekeeper of information, invitations, and family communication. The next afternoon brought another unexpected moment. Linda stopped by with a homemade pie. The two women sat together in the kitchen while sunlight poured through the windows. During their conversation, Linda mentioned seeing Jessica several times over the past year organizing family events, coordinating schedules, and managing communications for everyone. "She seems to like being in charge," Linda observed casually. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Yes," she replied. "I believe she does." Later that night, after Linda left, Eleanor sat alone with a notebook open in front of her. On one page, she listed every family event she had missed over the past 3 years. On another page, she wrote down every event she learned about only after it happened. The lists were longer than she expected, much longer. As she reviewed them, a calm certainty settled over her. She was no longer searching for answers. She had already found them. The real challenge now was deciding what to do with the truth. Because truth changes people. It changes relationships. It changes the stories families tell themselves. Eleanor closed the notebook and looked around the quiet house she had shared with Charles for more than 4 decades. For the first time since his passing, she felt something stronger than grief. She felt resolve. Someone had spent years quietly reducing her role within the family. Someone had counted on her remaining unaware. And very soon, that assumption was going to prove mistaken. By early the next week, Eleanor had begun to notice more subtle patterns in her family interactions. She walked slowly through the quiet house, noting the way sunlight fell across the kitchen floor, illuminating the same chairs her husband once occupied. Each step reminded her of years spent in these rooms, each memory now tinged with the awareness of exclusion. Michael called that Tuesday afternoon. His voice was polite, warm even, but Eleanor could sense the slight hesitation, the measured phrasing that seemed to have been influenced by Jessica. They spoke about mundane details at first, the weather, his work schedule, Sophie's college plans. Then he mentioned another family gathering, one she had not been informed about. Eleanor listened, attentive and calm, storing each detail without interrupting. She thanked him politely and ended the call, setting her phone down on the counter, taking a moment to breathe. That evening, she walked into the living room where sunlight was fading into a soft amber glow. She picked up a photo album and slowly turned the pages, observing past birthdays, holidays, and vacations. The contrast between the past inclusion and present absence was undeniable. Every recent photo seemed to reinforce her gradual displacement, yet Eleanor felt a quiet determination rising within her. She realized that noticing these patterns was the first step toward reclaiming her agency, toward understanding the dynamics she had been placed in. Later, she prepared a simple dinner, humming softly to herself while chopping vegetables and stirring a sauce. The process was comforting, familiar, and grounding. As she sat down to eat alone, she reflected on the nuances of family control, how subtle words, unspoken expectations, and gentle redirections could reshape relationships over time. That night, she reviewed her calendar and noted upcoming events, listing them carefully in her journal alongside the observations she had gathered. Each entry served as a map of the invisible boundaries being drawn around her, each note a step toward clarity. The following morning, she received a brief message from Sophie, who mentioned a casual outing with Michael and friends. Eleanor responded warmly but simply, observing the details Sophie provided, the timing, the participants. Later that day, she called Linda, recounting what she had learned, and together they discussed the patterns, strategies, and subtle ways to maintain dignity while remaining aware. As Eleanor hung up, she felt a sense of preparation. The pieces were becoming clear. Her role in the family had shifted over the years, quietly and without confrontation. Yet now, with patience, observation, and reflection, she understood the dynamics and was beginning to decide how to navigate them with poise. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the counters, yet Eleanor felt a steady light within. She realized that reclaiming awareness was more powerful than confrontation. She would continue to observe, note, and plan, cultivating a quiet resilience that would allow her to participate on her own terms, with clarity, insight, and dignity, prepared for whatever unfolded next in the family she had long nurtured and still cared for deeply. The turning point arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon. Eleanor had spent the morning organizing old documents in Charles's study when her phone vibrated with a new message. It came from Sophie. The text itself was simple. "Grandma, can I stop by later? I need to show you something." Eleanor agreed immediately. 3 hours later, Sophie arrived carrying a laptop and an expression that suggested she had been debating whether to share something important. They settled into the living room with cups of tea resting on the coffee table between them. For several minutes, Sophie spoke about school and upcoming exams. Then she took a deep breath and opened the laptop. "Grandma, I found something by accident." Eleanor remained calm. "What did you find?" Sophie turned the screen toward her. On it was a familiar messaging application. The family group chat. The same group chat Eleanor had heard about but never seen. Sophie had access because one of the conversations remained open on a shared family device. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken slightly as she read through the messages. Months of conversations stretched across the screen. Vacation plans, birthday dinners, holiday gatherings, weekend trips, dozens of events, hundreds of messages. What stood out was not what people said about her. In truth, they rarely mentioned her at all. What stood out was something else. Her absence had become normal. Invitations were discussed without including her. Schedules were arranged without considering her. Family decisions moved forward as though she simply existed outside the circle. Then Eleanor noticed several specific messages from Jessica. "Do not worry about asking Eleanor. She probably wants quiet time." Another read, "I already talked to her about it." Eleanor had never been consulted. Another message stated, "It is easier if we keep the plans simple." The sentence immediately reminded her of the comment she had overheard at Michael's house. "It is easier this way." Sophie watched quietly while Eleanor continued reading. Surprisingly, she did not feel angry. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of confirmation. For weeks, she had been piecing together fragments. Now she was looking directly at the completed picture. The truth was no longer hidden inside assumptions or suspicions. It was sitting plainly in front of her. What affected her most was Michael's participation. He rarely initiated these conversations, yet he rarely challenged them either. He accepted the explanations. He accepted the exclusions. He accepted the version of reality that had been created around him. When Eleanor finally closed the laptop, the room remained silent. Sophie looked worried. "Are you okay?" Eleanor smiled softly. "I think so." And strangely, she meant it. Because uncertainty is exhausting. Doubt drains a person in ways they do not notice until it disappears. The truth might be painful, but it is also clarifying. For the first time in months, Eleanor no longer questioned her instincts. She no longer wondered whether she was imagining things. She no longer searched for excuses on behalf of everyone else. The evidence spoke for itself. After Sophie left, Eleanor walked slowly through the house. The familiar rooms no longer felt quite as lonely. Something had changed. Not the family, not the circumstances. Herself. She stopped in front of a photograph of Charles resting on the fireplace mantel. Looking at his smiling face, she remembered something he often said whenever life became complicated. "You cannot control what people choose, Ellie. You can only control what you choose next." Standing there in the quiet living room, Eleanor realized exactly what her next step would be. She would not argue. She would not accuse. She would not beg for inclusion. Instead, she would finally have an honest conversation with her son. And for the first time, that conversation would be based entirely on facts. The following Sunday afternoon, Eleanor called Michael and invited him to dinner. Just him. No family gathering. No special occasion. No audience. Her voice remained calm throughout the conversation. Michael agreed without hesitation. If he felt surprised, he did not show it. For the next several days, Eleanor prepared carefully, not because she planned to confront him, but because she wanted clarity. The difference mattered. Confrontation seeks victory. Clarity seeks truth. On Thursday evening, she set the dining room table for 2 people. The same table where she and Charles had hosted countless family meals over the years. The same table where Michael learned to eat with proper manners as a child. The same table where birthdays, holidays, and milestones had once brought everyone together. As she arranged the plates, she found herself remembering simpler times. Back then, family felt effortless. Nobody managed invitations. Nobody controlled information. People simply showed up because they wanted to be together. Shortly after 6 o'clock, Michael arrived. He looked tired, older somehow. Eleanor noticed the faint lines around his eyes as he stepped into the house. They hugged briefly before sitting down for dinner. The first half hour passed pleasantly enough. They talked about work, Sophie, and everyday concerns. Michael complimented the meal. Eleanor smiled and thanked him. The conversation felt familiar, comfortable. Yet beneath it all, both seemed aware that something larger remained unsaid. Finally, after dessert, Eleanor stood and walked into the living room. She returned carrying a small folder. Michael immediately noticed the change in her expression. Not anger, not sadness, certainty. She placed the folder on the table and sat down. "There are some things I want to understand," she said quietly. Michael looked confused but nodded. Eleanor began carefully. She mentioned the canceled dinner after Charles passed away. Then the family brunch she never heard about. The cabin trip. The group chat. One event after another. One fact after another. She did not accuse. She simply presented the truth exactly as she had experienced it. At first, Michael seemed puzzled, then uncomfortable, then silent. Several times he opened his mouth to respond before stopping himself. The room grew very still. Finally, Eleanor slid several printed messages across the table. Messages Sophie had shown her. Messages discussing plans she had never known existed. Messages claiming she had already been informed when she had not. Michael stared at the pages. His face slowly lost color. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Eleanor waited patiently. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "I did not know about some of this," he admitted quietly. Eleanor believed him, not because she wanted to, because his reaction felt genuine. Yet another realization followed immediately. Whether he knew or not, he had allowed someone else to manage his relationship with his mother. He had accepted assumptions without asking questions. He had trusted convenience over connection. The silence between them stretched for several moments. Then Michael spoke again. "Mom, I think I have made some mistakes." Eleanor looked at her son and saw something she had not seen in a very long time. Reflection. For the first time, he seemed to be viewing the situation through her eyes instead of his own. Outside, evening shadows settled across the neighborhood. Inside, the The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Questions were asked. Explanations were offered. Some answers helped. Others raised new questions. Yet when Michael finally left that night, one thing had changed. The truth was no longer hidden. It existed openly between them. And once truth enters a room, it becomes very difficult for anyone to pretend it is not there. The weeks that followed brought changes Eleanor never expected. Not dramatic changes. Not sudden transformations. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, the changes arrived quietly, one conversation at a time. 2 days after their dinner, Michael called again. Then he called the following week. Then the week after that. The calls were not long, but they were consistent. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt as though her son was speaking directly to her, instead of through the invisible filter that had slowly developed around their relationship. One Saturday morning, Michael stopped by unexpectedly with coffee and pastries. They sat together on the back porch where Charles had spent countless mornings watching birds gather near the feeder. The conversation felt easy, natural, familiar, as though two people were finally finding their way back toward each other after years of slowly drifting apart. Jessica remained polite whenever Eleanor saw her. Yet something had changed there as well. The confidence that once seemed effortless now appeared more cautious. Family plans were suddenly communicated directly to Eleanor. Invitations arrived earlier. Details were shared openly. Nobody announced these changes. Nobody explained them. They simply began happening. Eleanor understood why. Truth has a way of altering behavior even when nobody discusses it openly. One afternoon, several months later, the entire family gathered for a holiday meal. The house was full of laughter, conversation, and familiar voices. At one point, Sophie showed Eleanor a recent family photograph taken during a weekend outing. Everyone was there, including her. It seemed like a small thing, yet Eleanor smiled when she saw it. Not because she needed proof that she belonged. She no longer needed that. The photograph simply reflected a reality that had finally become visible again. As the evening continued, Eleanor found herself standing quietly in the kitchen watching family members move through the house. For a brief moment, she thought about everything that had happened since Charles passed away. The loneliness, the confusion, the discoveries, the difficult conversations. Looking back, she realized something important. The greatest loss had never been the missed dinners or forgotten invitations. It had been the gradual erosion of connection, the feeling of becoming invisible without understanding why. Yet she had learned something equally important. People cannot redefine your worth unless you allow them to. They cannot erase your place in a family simply because they stop acknowledging it. Value does not disappear because someone chooses not to see it. Later that evening, after everyone left, Eleanor stood alone in the dining room. The same room where she had once waited for a son who never arrived. The same room where she later sat across from him and shared difficult truths. Now the table was covered with empty plates, used napkins, and the happy disorder that follows a family gathering. Eleanor smiled softly as she began cleaning up. The house no longer felt hollow. The silence no longer felt heavy. Most importantly, she no longer felt uncertain. She had spent months searching for answers only to discover that the real solution was not forcing others to value her. It was remembering her own value first. Before going to bed, Eleanor paused beside Charles's photograph one final time. The familiar smile looking back at her seemed almost reassuring. She touched the frame lightly and glanced around the home they had built together. Family relationships would never be perfect. Mistakes would happen. People would disappoint one another. Yet honesty had opened a door that silence never could. And as Eleanor turned off the lights and headed upstairs, she realized something she wished she had understood much sooner. Sometimes the strongest response to being quietly pushed aside is not anger, revenge, or bitterness. Sometimes it is simply refusing to disappear.